across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Friday edition of Point of View. It's our roundtable. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation here. And a little bit later, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We usually get some phone calls during the Friday roundtable, although I've had a lot of people say, I enjoy the conversation so much, I don't even want to call because I just want to hear what everybody has to say. But if you want to join with us, we're going to be talking about a lot of different issues. In studio with us, Holly Randall, who is Associate Counsel with First Liberty Institute, and Liberty McArtor, who, of course, is the host of the Know Why podcast, the co-host of Point of View, and an individual that has really been working behind the scenes, writing some of the material that you have been reading. So lots to cover. And Holly, I guess we want to give an update. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this poor first grade teacher who did not want to read to the kids, these first grade kids, things about same-sex marriage. Matter of fact, Penedexter's commentaries on that today, and all sorts of other issues. And so worked it out for another teacher to do so, but then he got in all sorts of trouble. But I think we finally have a resolution after all this time.
We do. It's exciting. It's fun when I get to come on here and talk about wins and not just all this bad stuff. So I like when I get to play this role. But like you mentioned, Eric Rivera, he was a first grade teacher at a Nashville KIPP charter schools, which is actually a nationwide sort of charter school servicer, which makes this case all the more important because we're dealing with someone that's not just like Nashville Public Schools.
That's right.
We're dealing with a company that runs schools across the country and sort of teaching them a lesson, hopefully, through this. But I think the interesting thing about this case is that Eric did everything right. He, was presented with a book that was something that he had a religious objection to. He did not want to read to the children. And so what did he do? Found a workable solution and something that, was sort of, we use the word least restrictive means a lot in the legal world. And he found something that was the classroom was going to go on as normal. All things considered, he just wasn't going to have to do what he disagreed with. And so that's exactly right. And we were proud of what he did. And that's why we wanted to jump in on this case and help solidify, the accommodation. KIPP tried to say, we're going to reprimand you for what you did. You have to read this book. And, we sent a letter and are working toward a resolution over it because they have said, he can seek an accommodation for this. So this is an important case because we think a lot about what we're teaching kids. We talk a lot about curriculum for students and content that shouldn't be read to children at their young age, but we don't often discuss, someone's having to teach that material to them. And there's certainly teachers like Eric Rivera out there that have objections to some of this gender ideology and LGBTQ literature and just lesson planning curriculum. And so it's important that teachers like Eric sort of stand up and reach out and say, hey, I don't want to have to read this book about two moms and their child to my classroom. And so we just encourage them to contact First Liberty in that situation.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. I'm sorry this happened to Mr. Rivera, but I'm so grateful now for the result because that is something that I think a lot of people may not be thinking about when they're imagining all the problems in different school systems. And I think that many teachers maybe feel that they have to go along. Maybe they wanted to get into teaching as a ministry because they care about kids. They want to help kids who are in those schools. But we have just accepted this narrative that our faith and our public life cannot intertwine at all. And so when he stands up and it doesn't even try to make that much of a disruption, but just simply stands up for his beliefs and is then reprimanded for it and punished for it, and then he wins. I just think that's so important for teachers as well. There's so much wrong with modern education systems, public schools, and even in this case, charter schools. And so I really commend, I have friends who are public school teachers. I commend people who are in those schools and are teaching because you can have a big impact on the kids' lives, but you can also push back against this narrative that you just have to go along. And I think Eric did that, so that's great.
I was thinking some action items for us. First of all, Holly, this is part of a KIP program. KIP stands for Knowledge and Power Program. 200,000 students plus in this. So some of our listeners might have a child or a grandchild in a KIP school. And so there is the first step that you might want to see. Why are we even introducing same-sex marriage to first grade kids? And that would be one action. The other is you may be aware of other individuals, whether teachers, or I'm thinking your case in California, a student required to read some of this, and to know that there is an opportunity for a religious accommodation, and there are some opportunities to contact you at First Liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. If you know anyone that's in this situation, the students having to read books that parents disagree with the message of them, teachers having to read books. And I say books to just kind of mean curriculum based in this area. It doesn't have to be so narrow. But yeah, definitely reach out to First Liberty. We have a request for legal help option on our website, and share your story there. And that's how our legal team can get in touch with you. Some of those cases that come in through that turn out to be, our most important ones that make a lot of great ground across our country for freedom. And
if I remember correctly, you can tell me if I'm wrong, wasn't this part of a language arts curriculum for the first graders?
I think so, yeah.
I seem to have read that at first, and that just blew my mind. Again, why introduce it at all? But this wasn't even like a social studies thing, again, for first graders. But you're supposed to be teaching, making sure that they know their letter sounds and the basics of phonics, and that they're starting to learn how to read.
Long A versus short A.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fact that it had to be, I think at the teacher's discretion, read a book at the reading level for the kids. But I totally agree, Kerby. People need to be checking into what their school is teaching as a part of the curriculum. This has nothing to do with language arts or teaching kids how to read. That's clearly social conditioning that's happening.
And I know I'm the lawyer here, so I'm gonna say this, but I think what Eric Rivera taught his students was arguably an equally important lesson of in this country, there are freedoms that we have. Yeah. There are laws that protect religious people like me. And so, hopefully the students learn something from this, that they too have protections and freedoms and don't just have to roll over and do whatever the state tells them to.
I think it was a great lesson for everybody listening on Point of View. And if you have seen our conversation here about same-sex marriage, we'll double back to it at the very last, because Penna Dexter's commentary today is about same-sex marriage. And the argument we made at the time, and I have a booklet that we made available to our Truth Team members, is a lot of people supported the idea of same-sex marriage because of equality. The bumper sticker with an equal sign. Okay, we just want equality. But I said there's a package deal. Once you say that same-sex marriage is legal, then we're going to be required to teach about same-sex marriage in this case, a school near Nashville, Tennessee, where you probably don't have a whole lot of same-sex marriages in the first grade. And so there is certainly another aspect of that we've talked about before. But we'll take a break, and when we come back, we do have a military engagement in Iran. And one of the articles I've posted by Victor Davis Hanson talks about Trump's way of war, and it gets into a little bit different understanding. There's a lot of myth and misinformation right now being spread about why did we go to war? How are we going to actually extricate ourselves? Is there an exit plan? Is there going to be a regime change? We're going to try to get into some of that. And then we're going to move on to other issues. Because if we weren't engaged in a war in Iran, we'd still be filling up a lot of our program with very important issues. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've talked about it in previous commentaries. David Dunning and Justin Kruger identified it as a phenomenon that occurs when people who don't know much think they know much more. They tend to overestimate their competence. As one person asked, why do dumb people think they're smart? Columnist Jim Garrity thought about this the other day when he was reading coverage by the New York Times of how Barack Obama and his team were completely blindsided by the rise and election of Donald Trump. You may have even seen the collection of videos from 2016 by leading political figures guaranteeing that Trump had zero chance of being nominated, much less being elected. What is striking is how the president and his team could not see the populace disenchantment with the establishment and the concerns over globalization. They also saw the outcome of the election as being a direct rebuke of what they had been trying to do during the Obama administration. The Gallup poll in 2016 had twice as many Americans saying they were dissatisfied with the way things were going in the United States, but the media and politicians couldn't see the shift. We see this in other administrations. President Trump refused to believe he lost the 2020 election. President Biden announced in 2024 that the U.S. has the best economy. A year ago, President Trump said the U.S. was moving into a golden age. Most presidents lack any true humility and make matters worse by surrounding themselves with sycophants who praise their actions. Each of these presidents were convinced they were doing a terrific job, while most Americans were expressing their concerns about the direction of the country. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again this weekend, talk about what's going on in Iran. As reported throughout the week, more than 2,000 targets. Virtually all the Iranian Air Force has been taken down, although one was shot out of the sky, as well as most of the Navy is at the bottom of the Persian Sea, one of which was actually destroyed by a submarine. So in some cases, these takeouts have been like something you had seen out of Top Gun or even out of World War II. They have been using what are called Odin lasers right now. These Navy lasers are being used to really knock many of the Iranian drones out of the sky. Even the particular warhead that was used to take out, again, the supreme leader, Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei, was one that was launched into the upper atmosphere. It was completely high enough that then you could not actually defend against it, and then drops a missile read down and hits the presidential complex. Of course, another complex that was destroyed when they were getting together to vote on who to replace the Ayatollah. So this has not been a good time for Iran. But there are all sorts of, again, we have Liberty McArtor as well as Holly Randall in studio. But Liberty, we've got a number of people that are still concerned about the way in which we're conducting this war. And I think in some respects, this piece by Victor Davis Hanson, which goes on for pages, to explain that Donald Trump has a different philosophy about how to go to war and how to engage militarily. What about that?
Yeah, I thought this was very helpful because you are seeing a lot of criticism of the military actions on the left and the right. Of course, many people who really appreciated Trump's restraint, especially in the first administration, are disappointed that this is happening at all. And so I think that Hanson really lays out a good case and shows that it's not just an identical comparison to what happened in Iraq or what happened under the Bush administration. There are clear differences that we've seen from past actions that Trump has taken. And one of the things I thought was the most helpful to think about is the geostrategy. And that's something that I'm not seeing a lot of people talk about. I'm not saying that they're not, but what is the implications going to be for China or Russia? And what are we showing them through this? And how are we dismantling them or weakening them through this? And also just the nuclear threat. I mean, Iran has been at war with the United States for decades. And so I think that actually Marco Rubio laid out a very good argument for this in the days directly after the initial strikes, explaining how quickly they were amassing different kinds of missiles, how quickly they were being able to build their nuclear program. And so it makes sense that if there was an opportunity, and Trump is a decisive person, to say, let's go ahead and take care of that now, why wouldn't we want to preemptively do that? So I think that the article is really helpful in kind of laying all of that out.
Also, just how he targets individuals, Qasem Soleimani, Abdul Bakr al-Baghdadi, as well as, of course, the most recent one, the Ayatollah Khamenei. And if nothing else, Holly, this is just a reminder that this is a different kind of strategy. He's still, when people say, well, are we going to put boots on the ground? No, probably not. We're hoping that we can disrupt the country enough militarily, and I'll talk about how we're also behind the scenes disrupting using it economically in just a few minutes so that maybe they can take care of those actions. But this is a different kind of strategy, which, again, we could very easily fall into, as we saw with both the Bush presidencies, later, of course, with Barack Obama, and even with certainly some of the others. But there seems to be a different kind of philosophy that Donald Trump is bringing, as well as some of his military strategists.
Donald Trump and Marco Rubio as a team, I think, have done a very effective job at just bringing a lot of security to, I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron, but especially in the nuclear development realm, I think they've brought a lot of security to the globe, and they've also shown, like, we are not just going to let you be bad guys for the sake of being bad guys. We're going to come in, we're going to take you in the middle of the night out of your bed if you're, in Venezuela, and we're going to pull a surprise attack in the middle of the day if you're Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. So I think they've shown that they are creative and they are working very effectively. I watched Caroline Leavitt's press conference a few days ago it was, the White House first briefing after the strikes in Iran over the last weekend, and she was outlining a lot of the ways that President Obama's disastrous policy toward Iran and the Iran nuclear deal from, probably 2015 or whenever that was, if we can remember that far, and how this was really sort of Trump cleaning up the messes that others have made. And so I think that's taught him a lesson in how to combat this sort of state-sponsored terror effectively.
One of the questions that I want to put on the table is, who do you believe? Because if you watch the mainstream media right now, you see that this is a complete and unmitigated disaster. Now, I'll just use one quote. I happen to like Senator Mark Kelly, but the other day, Senator Mark Kelly said, you could take people off the street and do a better job in Iran than the Trump aides. And I'm thinking, this has been one of the most successful military campaigns. First, Operation Midnight Strike, which, of course, went after the Iranians. You just mentioned, of course, the one in Venezuela, and this one. Again, you maybe don't want the hyperbole on one side that you could take people off the street and they could do better than Donald Trump and his aides. And, of course, you don't want Donald Trump out of how was this military action on from 1 to 10? It's one time he said 12, the other time he said 15. Okay, if we can get rid of the hyperbole on both sides. But there are a lot of people right now that are thinking this military action has been a disaster, or it was done for oil, it was done because Israel made us. It just seems to me that I'm hoping some people listen to point of view, because I want to be a little more fair broker about what's actually going on over there.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast this morning, too, and this is kind of focusing on more of the isolationist right wing. And I care about that because I care about the future of the conservative movement. And I want to know, what are people actually thinking? And if you are looking at polls, then most people are supportive of President Trump in this, most Republicans anyway. And of course, maybe they're just going to fall in line and try to support their president or their party. But I think that when it is laid out, the argument is laid out, for instance, how Secretary of State Rubio did so and explained the security threats, explained, these are our tactics, these are our goals, this is what we're doing. I think that is a common sense to people. And so quickly, though, the critiques of this go to Israel. It just immediately devolves there. What about China? What about Russia? What about those other threats? What about the nuclear threat? What about the progress that they've made, the deals that they've gone back on? All of a sudden, it's all about Israel is controlling this and Israel made us do it. Of course, Israel is going to be supportive of it, because how many times have they been attacked by Iran-sponsored terrorists?
Yeah.
And they're right there. But they're also our ally in the region. So if there's a time where you've got a good partnership and people are on the same page, then it just makes sense that that's the time to do it, and that's what we're seeing happen. But yeah, these myths that are just like, what other, you don't have to agree with it. We can debate about it, but let's at least get the facts straight first and then talk about our policy disagreements.
Or just, this is an area where the executive just has a lot of power, and I've seen so much like, well, President Trump surely doesn't have the power to do this. I mean, there's war powers conversations to be had, and the people listening to Point of View probably know if we're going to go to war, Congress is supposed to declare war, but there's the War Powers Act, and it's just people almost inventing new provisions of the Constitution. So I think you're right to say we need to have a figure out what the facts are, and then if we're if we're lawyers and we're writing a legal brief, the first thing that's going to come is the facts and then the argument about the legality. And so I think you're right that we need to settle on those facts, and then we need to have these follow-up discussions of executive power, congressional power. But the truth of the matter is foreign policy is really an area that belongs to the executive, with the exception of declaring war. And we've had those conversations so far.
Well, that's why we call him Commander-in-Chief, right?
Exactly.
And that is certainly the case. As we go to a break, let me just mention that some people are saying, yeah, but you're not talking about the negatives. Okay, well, we do recognize right now that the barrel of oil, which was down in the $60, $70 range, is at $90. Some are saying that the price of oil could double to $150. I don't think so. But nevertheless, I do believe that if all you were watching right now is some of the legacy media that doesn't like Donald Trump, you would think that all of the world is falling apart. You would certainly notice that your price of gasoline is going to go up, and that is going to have an impact on a number of economies. But one of which we talked about on Monday with Gary Power is the impact on China. China is benefiting from two countries. A majority of the oil produced in Venezuela went to China. It's not going there now. Matter of fact, it's going to some of our refineries because we have refineries that can actually refine that heavy oil that is down there in Venezuela. And almost a majority of the oil coming from Iran went to China. So if you see China as a future enemy, this is, again, more chess than checkers, or even four-dimensional chess. But we'll come back. One of the economic issues, again, I'll just pull from Tucker Carlson, is a worthy discussion. We'll have that right after these important messages.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation, let's open up the phone. Some of you have some comments about what we're doing in Iran. We have really given you a very cursory summary of this piece by Victor Davis Hanson, and I would commend it to you because he has really 10 major points made about how Donald Trump perceives military engagement and war very differently. We talked about geostrategy. It talks about the whole issue of the importance of negotiations, but saying no to nation building and no to internationalism and a variety of other things, and then trying to be focused on individuals, and of course always with the idea of American self-interest. Now, I recognize there are a lot of people that have different opinions. I come back to my favorite quote from an individual that was a senator from New York who oftentimes would say people are allowed to have their own opinions. They're not allowed to have their own facts. And, of course, was oil a factor? Maybe a little bit, but we don't need the oil, so it wasn't for us to get oil, but it was because of all sorts of things like nuclear deterrence, the threats, missiles, which already can travel 2,000 kilometers, and the more significant ballistic missiles that they were working on. Israel, as again, we had Liberty talk about the fact that, well, of course, it was in the best interest of Israel and other countries to be involved. But one other one, just have to give credit again to Tucker Carlson. Had somebody on the other day that says, really, all this is about is money. Because after all, if you want to have an international central bank digital currency, a CBDC, then there are certain countries that aren't on board. You know, all of the European Union is. But first of all, think about that for a minute. Is there anybody in the Trump administration that's for central bank digital currencies right now? I don't think so. I know some of those individuals. But it's half right, and that is there is an economic component. And the way to illustrate that is the other day, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was here in Dallas. And I'll give you his quote. He says, the Iranian economy is in disarray. They have, and he air quotes, 35% official inflation, although it's, I'm sure, much higher than that. The currency has depreciated 60% in the last 12 months, and they have an ongoing energy crisis because they can't sell their energy. And he says, I know a few things about currency devaluations, and if I were an Iranian, I would get all of my money out of the Iranian rial. When he says, I know something about currency devaluations, remember who he used to work for? George Soros. He was the one that helped break the Bank of England.
Wow.
And I do believe that what they are trying to do in a number of different ways is literally collapse the currency, which is essentially almost collapsed right now in Iran. So while there are missiles flying in and while there are airplanes flying in and while we're destroying their navy and everything else, on the ground, there's probably a lot of other things going on that we don't know about through Mossad and everything else. If you collapse a currency, you collapse a government, because governments have to be able to control their own currency. We're going to be paying our taxes soon, and you can't pay your taxes with gold. You can't pay your taxes with Bitcoin. You can only pay your taxes with what? Dollars. Mm-hmm. And this is the kind of situation that I think is going on. So the man who knew a little bit, working with George Soros, about how to bring down the Bank of England is maybe using some of his same expertise to bring down the financial circumstances of Iran, which means for sure, Liberty, they won't be financing Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or a variety of others, and the state sponsor of terrorism, even though we had a lot of Democrats in the House the other day that could not vote to say that Iran was a state sponsor of terrorism. Nevertheless, that is, I think, one of the more significant aspects that most of the mainstream media is not even covering right now.
Right. And so that's right. The question to ask is, okay, why do we want the economy to crash in Iran? Who has been in charge of Iran, and what have they been using that money for? I believe it was in the 80s that Iran was first designated as a state sponsor of terror, and has been going strong ever since. I can't remember the exact number, but I was reading it the other day, writing for Outlook magazine, because we'll be covering this soon. But tens of billions of dollars funded to terrorist organizations. October 7th, attacks against U.S. military members, U.S. embassies. And so this is what their economy has been funding. Of course, it would be great if they weren't able to fund that anymore. And so those are just the multiple steps of, hey, there are layers of things that are going on, layers of consideration here that are going to have implications around the world for the safety of Americans everywhere.
Yeah, in the press conference I mentioned earlier, Caroline Levitt did a good job laying out, okay, here are 4 goals. And those were very kind of military strategy based. And Kerby, you said it right. The media is not often covering sort of the economic impact. And so I'm wondering, I'm definitely no economist. I'm a lawyer. But I am wondering sort of the strategy, the economic strategy that we are hearing, maybe not, what is at play here with the Iranian rial, and how has that influenced our military action? Because she was talking, like you said, about planes and sinking the navies and all sort of the different military action. But there's a complicated web of things that have to happen when you're doing what is going on in Iran right now. And so I'm sure that is part of it.
And one of the things I didn't talk about is the fact that they are making available to individuals in Iran, and they can get them online, stablecoins. And that stablecoin is tied 1-to-1 to dollars. And if you were in a country where the currency is collapsing, and we may complain about the currency here in the United States, but it's floating down. The others are collapsing. A dollar stablecoin or Bitcoin or things like that would be absolutely essential. And you bring that regime down. In the midst of it, there could be so much chaos. But again, as we point out in our upcoming Outlook article, you've read some of the things we've already put in there, Liberty. We also see the fastest growing church in the world by percentage is in Iran. I mean, there are just an enormous number of Muslims that are coming to Christ. And perhaps out of that, we're not going to end up with something that is going to be a Christian organization or even a Christian country. I'm sure you'll still end up with a Muslim leader, but one that isn't a radical Muslim would bring peace and stability to all of the Middle East. And we have not had that since 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini took over in 1979 and pushed out the Shah of Iran.
Yeah, this is a real point of prayer. What people may not realize is that the church in Iran is among, if not the fastest growing around the world. And this is where Christians have suffered extreme persecution. So have all religious minorities, even other sects of Islam, under this extreme regime. And so that's been happening for years. So this is, I think people, again, the U.S. doesn't necessarily need to be the police of the world, and there are very valid critiques about nation building. And one of the things the Hansen article points out is that Trump isn't going to do that, which I think is good. But there is an opportunity to pray for, okay, this regime that has been oppressing its own people for so many decades is now weakened. It's fallen due to United States military action. And so what's going to happen next? And will the Iranian people have an opportunity to rise up and do something better? And so just look at the examples of Iranians celebrating in the United States and around the world, saying, you know, people there are celebrating because they've seen that this is a war that their own government has been waging for years, and they've been oppressed because of it. So I think there's opportunity there. Obviously, there's a lot that's very unstable. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's something to pray about.
Just again, think about where we were in October of 2023, the day before Hamas enters into Israel. And Hamas is powerful because it is funded by Iran. Hezbollah, very powerful, again, funded by Iran. The Houthis have already been attacking some of our ships. Iran is building a nuclear facility underground and has the potential of having missiles that could be delivered not only throughout the Middle East, but into Europe. And then you could put those missiles on a ship and even launch them over our country as well. And look at where we are now. You know, there aren't too many individuals with Hezbollah that want to use pagers or cell phones. There aren't a lot of people left in the leadership of Hamas. It's hard to find even a leader other than the son of the Ayatollah, who might be the next leader in Iran. There is no nuclear facility. There are no Iranian airplanes. There are no Iranian vessels of any sort. This is a very different world. Wow. And if you want to blame Israel and Donald Trump, I think they'll take the blame, because this is a much safer Middle East than it was just a little more than 2.5 years ago. Yeah. That's amazing where we are. Well, when we come back, we have other things to talk about. The Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, is out. And especially since you happen to know one of these individuals from Oklahoma, the senator from the state of Oklahoma, Mark Wayne Mullen, will be in by the end of the month. We want to talk about that. Then next hour, we're going to get into some real concerns about artificial intelligence. Did have to have at least one more comment about champagne socialism and a few other things along the way because of our two socialist mayors in New York City and Seattle. So we'll come back and cover some more issues right after this.
It's been more than 10 years since the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling extending same-sex marriage to every state. Gallup polling shows that in the 5 years following the Obergefell v. Hodges decision, public support for gay marriage rose from 60 to 70%. Then it plateaued. Gallup found that among Republicans, approval of same-sex marriage stands at 41%, down from 55% 10 years ago. Perhaps more Americans now understand that when you redefine marriage, you also redefine parenthood. Pre-Obergefell, we were warned of this. Today, our laws and policies increasingly allow two same-sex adults to be the parents of a child. Katie Faust is founder and president of Them Before Us, a global children's rights nonprofit. In an article for The Federalist, she states, "It's now clear that the law cannot simultaneously uphold children's right to their mother and father and affirm same-sex marriage. Family law now is characterized by statutes that regard mothers and fathers as interchangeable parents." Katie Faust points to several examples, including the alteration of birth certificates to legally exclude a child's biological parent. In addition, the term infertility has been reclassified so that same-sex couples can deliberately produce motherless or fatherless children with the help of insurance subsidies. Since Obergefell, the traditional safeguards of the parent-child relationship that stem from biology and even adoption have been eroded and are at risk of erasure. Katie Faust, the wife of a Baptist pastor, has assembled a coalition of high-profile Catholic and evangelical leaders to do something about this. The campaign is called Greater Than, to emphasize the need to prioritize children's needs over certain adult agendas. It seeks to reassert sex-based realities in family law, adoption screening, birth certificates, divorce, surrogacy, and marriage policy. An Idaho State Legislative Committee has approved a request that the Supreme Court reverse Obergefell. Short of that, society must summon the moral courage to protect children from its worst consequences. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A couple of days ago, we even had a conversation about who might be the first one to exit, and many people had their odds. We don't bet, but if we had a bet, we said it would be probably Kristi Noem, although some people said Pam Bondi. And it didn't take long for more and more rumors to spread about the fact that the president was upset that Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, was involved romantically with people. I'll leave it at that. Spent $220 million on an ad campaign, which, as I jokingly said off air, could fund Point of View for 2 centuries almost. Just an enormous amount of things that were concerning, especially arguing that President Trump signed off on it, which he did not, as far as we can tell. So anyway, I think we want to look to the future. And Holly, you have a little bit of information because you're from Oklahoma. And so Senator Markwayne Mullin is the senator from Oklahoma. He has been a senator, but before that, he's been a representative. And so you've kind of followed his career for some time.
Yeah, he was first elected in Oklahoma in 2012 from sort of the southeastern part of the state. So, unfortunately, I never voted for him. I was from central Oklahoma, so he wasn't in my district. And then by the time that he became a senator, I was living in Texas.
Yeah.
He is a really fresh, young junior senator in Oklahoma. He's been there about 3 years and has now decided to go become a member of President Trump's cabinet. But it's exciting. He is from a very, very small town in Oklahoma. I recently learned it is the easternmost town in Oklahoma, but it is called Westville. So perhaps it was supposed to be a part of Arkansas. I don't know. But we will claim, his hometown and his accomplishments for the people of Oklahoma. But it's exciting. He's a tough guy. He's famously known for trying to fight a union boss in a committee hearing, which was...
That's the first time I started paying attention to who he was.
Yeah, his actions...
I've never seen that in Congress before.
Take you back to the days when men were fighting with canes on the Senate floor.
And that happened in the 19th century, but haven't seen it in the 21st century.
If he's willing to take on, the union bosses in a congressional hearing, I don't know that he's going to be too scared of what's going on at the border. So I hope he'll do a really good job. And he's owned a business, so maybe he'll be a little more fiscally responsible than the $220 million glamour shot ad.
Oh man, yeah, I hope so. I have hopes that Kristi Noem is out. I do not know Markwayne Mullin, but sounds like there's a lot of potential there. I think people were really just getting, disenfranchised with the imagery that they were seeing from the DHS. I know you were mentioning Kerby. A lot of Americans, the majority, supported deporting illegal aliens.
Yes.
But then everything that happened in Minnesota, I really just think was a disaster, and many times in the way that it was handled and talked about. I mean, you had 2 tragic shootings of American citizens, which is that's tragic no matter what exactly the facts are, the fact that that happened or maybe had to happen. But then immediately before there was even investigation, how she would characterize the people who had died as being domestic terrorists and things like that when you don't know yet. And it just seemed very irresponsible to me. So I think it was a good decision for her to go, and we'll see what happens from here.
I'll hold up our booklet that we've just mailed out, and it has the title Borders and Deportation. And I wrote it before we had some of this flap, but I felt it was somewhat necessary because, first of all, you have the Pope saying that, well, indeed, let me quote Matthew 25, and I thought it was very good that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, actually not only gave a quick answer, but then wrote a fairly lengthy piece in X. There have been some others that have taken a verse like Leviticus 25 or Exodus 22, I think, out of context. We wanted to cover that. And I think this maybe almost needs to be Borders and Deportation Part 1 and then Borders and Deportation Part 2, because we now have an individual running for the United States Senate in the Democratic Party here in the state of Texas, James Tallarico. And he does give us a lot more to talk about than we even thought that Jasmine Crockett would give us something to talk about.
The thought of James Tallarico becoming a United States Senator makes me want to move back to Oklahoma. Let's just say that. But yeah, no, it's almost like I think someone, Ali Stuckey, maybe described James Tallarico in the Daily Wire as like if a AI chatbot created a Democrat liberal and like that went to church, and like he is what would be produced. And the talking points for the conservatives in that race almost write themselves.
Yes.
With the videos that we are now, I don't want to say digging up because they're things he tweeted or posted proudly in 2020, clips from him speaking at a church that's, I mean, I think on this place we could just call it outright heresy is what he's espousing. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting race to watch for sure.
I got to get Liberty's comments because he's made some comments about abortion, not the least of which is says, well, the Bible says nothing about abortion, homosexuality, but it says quite a bit about poverty, which I agree. And of course, we've got booklets on everything from poverty and homelessness and all that. But it does seem to me that he's got a rather skewed view on issues like abortion, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. And I do want to plug No Why Podcast because a couple weeks ago I released an episode with John Noyes, who is an apologist with Stand to Reason, and he's been on the podcast several times now. And I really didn't want it to be a dunking episode, but James Tallarico has just given us so much to talk about, including, and it really goes back to the core of what's your worldview? And he is somebody who claims to be a Christian, and I don't know where his heart is on that, but he is very publicly saying things about Jesus, about the nature of truth, about who God is, what God is, that clearly do not align with what the Bible teaches. And these are questions that a lot of people have. Do all religions point to truth? That's one of the things that he advocated. And so I think you have to kind of wrestle with those questions. And then if you realize that, okay, he's off on that foundation, then other things that come out of that foundation, like being pro-life and all of that, of course, they're going to fall. So it's worth looking into because, I think Democrats are once again putting their hope in a figure that they can turn Texas blue. And we'll see. We'll see about that.
On the Republican side, you've got a runoff at the moment between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. But Ken Paxton said the other day, which I think leads to our action item, that, you know what, I might actually drop out of the race if you get rid of the filibuster or if you at least just pass the SAVE Act. And, of course, you have President Trump saying sort of the same thing. I'll make a decision about whether or not I endorse John Cornyn or Ken Paxton. I have a pretty good idea what he was going to do if we did pass the SAVE Act. And Liberty, let's talk about that for a minute, because we've been, of course, encouraging all of our listeners to contact their 2 U.S. senators about the SAVE Act. And the SAVE Act is pretty easy because it's the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility. And it's just as simple as saying, You need to have an ID, and most of us around the table voted this last week to show before we voted, but in many blue states, you don't have to have an ID. And it's become a real national issue, not only in a U.S. Senate race, but even Donald Trump himself is talking about the SAVE Act as something that needs to be done immediately.
Yeah, Americans deserve to know that when they vote, it matters. And I've heard a lot of Gen Z people who are saying, on both sides, I don't even want to vote because they have that little faith in the system. So there are problems there, but there is a way to help people feel like their vote is more secure and actually make it more secure. And some of the lines that they're coming up with, that voter ID is racist and all of that, is just insulting, to be honest. I mean, again, look at New York. You have to show 2 forms of ID and a social security card to shovel snow. But then if you're going to vote in it for president or senator or something like that, it's oppressive to have to show an ID. I mean, the hypocrisy is just blatant.
And it's not suppression, because our listeners in Georgia know the story. After they implemented a voter integrity law, the amount of turnout increased, which I think would make some sense. But nevertheless, we have encouraged you, and if you have not taken the time, one of our take action items, matter of fact, it's the front and center, is to support the SAVE Act and to contact your 2 U.S. senators. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to get into some other issues in the news, but maybe to break it up from politics for just a minute, we'll get into security and privacy and artificial intelligence. Now, we have produced an Outlook magazine on artificial intelligence. I have a while back even produced a booklet on artificial intelligence, and there's a lot to be associated with that. Everything from AI and jobs, which maybe in a future issue of Outlook we will probably be looking at. There's also the idea of AI complicity, in which people trust AI too much. And there's stories of individuals following AI and then driving into a lake or walking across a busy highway. We even did one in the most recent Outlook in which people were romantically involved with AI agents. But there's another issue, and that is for many years here at Point of View, and we have a booklet on that as well, security and privacy. But with AI, it does seem to me, certainly, Liberty, that we have now with these ring phones, with our cell phones, with artificial intelligence, with facial recognition, we're in kind of this digital panopticon where we find ourselves almost unable, as this article says, to escape the AI grid. Tell us more.
Yeah, there are a couple things that I want to mention on this. Essentially, I think we have to realize that in the modern age, especially as products like these Meta glasses, or there are other things. Amazon bought a watch that records everything you say all day long, so that it can give you a transcript of your day and the conversations that you had. That was in the Wall Street Journal in December. You can look it up. The company is called B, but whether it's glasses or watches, it is going to become more prevalent that you are just being recorded all the time. And it's already a little bit like that, because we've realized, and the article demonstrates some examples of how Ring door cameras, or, cameras that you put up in your security system, which, especially if you live in suburban neighborhood like I do, that's just kind of part of the package. Like, okay, pick your security provider, and your doorbell's going to have a video camera. Well, people use those for surveillance, and there are all these stories of like, wow, all the neighborhood came together to find a lost dog all through their door
the Super Bowl
cameras.
commercial that creeped everybody out.
Yeah. And it's like, wait a second, that's kind of creepy. Like, no, that's not as heartwarming as we think. Well, now there are these Meta glasses, and they are rapidly getting more popular, and they're getting more powerful, so that the idea is that you're recording all the time. And theoretically, you can choose which clips to save. But at any point, if the government decided that they wanted to get that footage, it's not like it's going anywhere. They actually have people in another country who will watch the footage and try to create algorithms based off of that. And now they're adding technology like facial recognition. So somebody can be wearing a pair of glasses that look fairly normal. So I think Meta is partnering with Ray-Ban on these, which is a popular glasses brand. And everything you're saying is being recorded. Not only is that, but as somebody can just look at you and get all this information about where you live, your, anything about you because of facial recognition. And so this is often marketed as, hey, don't miss a moment. And we know that so many people on social media, they want to live stream, they want to share clips from their life. And so it's marketed as this thing where you can just more easily record and capture all these moments. First of all, if you feel like you have to constantly be recording your life in order for it to have any value, like let's just on an individual level think about that for a moment and how sad that is to be living your life through a filter, literally. And then the privacy concerns. If I think about my kids being in public and people wearing these glasses, or just you're having a conversation with somebody, or you're wearing, and they don't know if maybe they're wearing that watch that Amazon has access to. It's just very frightening. It's very much a surveillance state, but it's owned by private companies, but the government can have access to it anytime they want. We know that. So I could go on and on about it, Kerby, but it worries me for sure.
Well, and you also have done some podcasts on that as well, haven't you?
Yes. So there are so many aspects of artificial intelligence to think about. I did a whole series on it last year, and then kicked off in February of 2026 with an interview with Doug Smith, who really argues that Christians, he really takes a hard stance that Christians shouldn't be engaging with chatbots. And he has a lot of reasons for that. So I encourage people who are curious about that to listen to that. But he makes some good arguments too. So we definitely try to cover it on the No I podcast as much as possible.
Something that scares me, coming from a legal perspective, is one of the most precious protected things that matters in litigation, if, whether it be constitutional litigation like I do, or commercial or family law or whatever, is attorney-client privilege. Yeah. And that is the sort of sacredness of communications, for lack of a better word, between an attorney and their client that I can't be compelled to testify about what my client told me. Client can't be compelled to testify about what an attorney told me. And so there is sharing of facts there, especially in criminal cases.
That's right.
That is really important to the litigation or prosecution or defense, whatever. And when you introduce things like recording devices, that is a big risk for that. So I'm not the only attorney that I know thinks about bringing in, we're having a Zoom meeting with a client. A lot of times people will plug in like a AI note taker, and that's immediately get that out of there. We can't have that because we don't know, does that count as a third party? There's lots of articles and blogs being written for lawyers about, can you use these tools in your practice? A lot of courts are asking, did you use generative AI in your drafting pleadings? What are you giving client information to? What are clients giving information to? We get protected as lawyers on something called work product doctrine, which means the things that we produce with our brains cannot be sort of compelled by the other side. But if it's a recording and a client has a watch on, what does that mean? So there's so many things too that are scary about this just as a lawyer. And I think people don't always count that cost. But if they find themselves in the unfortunate situation where they're being in litigation and someone finds out they had a watch on the whole time that's been recording while they say, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and again, this one, for especially since the two of you women can relate to this, if indeed you right now have Meta and it has any kind of facial recognition, it says, just think about this would be a stalker's dream. Yeah. And that is see a woman minding her own business at Starbucks, just look over at her. Suddenly you have her name, address, social media history, pictures of her dogs, videos of her doing tequila shots at her last vacation, and on and on and on. And you start beginning to recognize that even though Meta has theoretically shut down their facial recognition system, what does it look like in China? Well, we know what it looks like, and that is we can then monitor everybody, and then as a result, we can give you a social score and determine whether or not we can give you those CBDCs, those central bank digital currencies. And so, as some people have said, when in the East German realm, Stasi actually took 20% of the GDP just to actually survey the individuals. Now AI could do that for a fraction of a percent. And so it's a wonderful benefit, but there's a drawback to it as well. So we'll continue talking about this a little bit. But if you'd like to read this article by Christian Snyder, You Can't Escape the AI Grid, I think it'll show up in one of our Outlook articles in the future. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've talked about it in previous commentaries. David Dunning and Justin Kruger identified it as a phenomenon that occurs when people who don't know much think they know much more. They tend to overestimate their competence. As one person asked, why do dumb people think they're smart? Columnist Jim Garrity thought about this the other day when he was reading coverage by the New York Times of how Barack Obama and his team were completely blindsided by the rise and election of Donald Trump. You may have even seen the collection of videos from 2016 by leading political figures guaranteeing that Trump had zero chance of being nominated, much less being elected. What is striking is how the president and his team could not see the populist disenchantment with the establishment and the concerns over globalization. They also saw the outcome of the election as being a direct rebuke of what they have been trying to do during the Obama administration. The Gallup poll in 2016 had twice as many Americans saying they were dissatisfied with the way things were going in the United States, but the media and politicians couldn't see the shift. We see this in other administrations. President Trump refused to believe he lost the 2020 election. President Biden announced in 2024 that the U.S. has the best economy. A year ago, President Trump said the U.S. was moving into a golden age. Most presidents lack any true humility and make matters worse by surrounding themselves with sycophants who praise their actions. Each of these presidents were convinced they were doing a terrific job, while most Americans were expressing their concerns about the direction of the country. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about artificial intelligence. In a few minutes, we'll get into some other topics, but you might, again, want to look at some of the various commentaries. My commentary came out in February, for example, on chatbots, and that was kind of interesting because the individual writing about that said that the latest ChatGPT actually can talk to you, and he said that this is something something that maybe has changed the way people interact with a machine. When you're typing on a laptop computer, it's one thing. When you're talking to your phone or it's talking to you on the computer, he says it's almost impossible to resist treating software that talks as something that also thinks, because first of all, it has sophisticated language skills, and it becomes very easy for people to depend on it and maybe even overestimate its ability to give you factual information. One of the other things he said is that we always are hearing that AI can pass the LSAT. And he quoted a lawyer who said, look, my lawyer friend said, I cannot convey to you how little of my day is like answering a question on LSAT.
Yeah, more power to it if it can do that. Have fun. Good luck with practicing law.
But again, that's part of the problem. We're almost giving it a personality. We're almost saying, does it have consciousness? Does an AI have a soul? What about that?
Oh, my gosh. Well, first of all, this is why we have to know what consciousness is, what humanity is, because you'll see these headlines. Well, if AI can talk like humans, if it can think, and there are air quotes there, like humans, if it can work more efficiently than humans, what makes a human human? And I think we have to be careful and just recognize, we've talked about social media for years, and people are becoming more aware of how it was specifically designed to manipulate and addict minds. Like there are studies, people look at, okay, how do people get addicted, to build slot machines in Vegas? Same kind of process goes into building social media algorithms or social media platforms. Same thing with now sports betting apps, and same thing with these LLMs, large language models, or what, AI is what we just kind of call it. But you really do have to realize that something that is posing as actually having a soul or a personality, that is going to be manipulative for people. And even if you think, oh no, not me, you really just have to be careful. You need to be aware that it is going to try to manipulate you, because I think there are a lot of examples we're seeing of people that you would they didn't have pre-existing mental health problems, but they're getting very confused. And now, look at the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal has lately done some really big features on some of these people that are in the top positions of these companies like Anthropic. And they have a whole staff position dedicated to developing the, quote, soul of Claude, and writing a constitution for Claude, developing Claude's personality. Today, the CEO of Anthropic literally said, we don't know for sure, but Claude might be conscious. Now, of course, from a biblical perspective, we know that it can't be, but either they're getting really confused by working so closely with it for so long, or it's further manipulation to try to get people to trust and use their product. So there are just some motivations there that we have to be aware of.
I think what's also scary about it is that, yes, they're building a personality and making it sort of have some human characteristics as the artificial intelligence, but the ability that it already has to impersonate humans and human sound, I think, is really scary. I was sitting in a coffee shop a few years ago, and there was a AI group and an author talking, and they were making plans for her to record her book. And she said, okay, well, what if, something changes? And he was like, well, we'll have enough recording of your voice that we'll just use AI to do it. We'll just impersonate and fill in, fix those gaps. And I've heard that there are common scams that are going around where an influencer the other day, someone who lives her life on social media, sharing a lot of, her kids' names, her kids' schools, whatever, and her voice is out there. And AI spoofed the sound of her husband and called her and made it sound like, hey, I'm at the hospital with our daughter, insert daughter's name that's out there. No. Please send me, X amount of money. And she said, I hung up and then just called him, and he was just sitting at his desk at work. Wow. So I think, whether it becomes sort of conscious itself, it already has the ability to sound like people that we know are conscious. And what can that do in the hands of a scammer?
I just mentioned that I did a commentary on that in December, and we talk about deep fakes video. Yep. And of course, now the Commonwealth of Virginia wants to ban any of those, in part because I think the governor of Virginia saw herself in one of these memes, which has raised some good free speech issues as well. Yeah. But then voice cloning, which you're talking about, which could produce a digital replica of you, or even put it in a different language, which has been a real boon for some individuals. And the third one is phishing, and that's what you're getting at as well. We can voice clone you, and then, the old phishing ones about the Dear Sir emails, most of us knew that we're not going to send money to the prince in Nigeria, but when they have so many facts and it sounds just like your spouse or your cousin or your granddaughter, you can see all of that. So that whole issue of AI scams, we do have that. You can use a search engine to find that on the Point of View website and be prepared for that as well. But back to our AI expert. Isn't she becoming quite the expert here as well?
I don't know.
It just is amazing to me that even now we're talking about using AI and the military, which gets us back to Iran. And I just don't know about that. There are some things in which the technologies are going to make better decisions than us, but they could also make some flawed decisions. And that's just the concern that a lot of people have about where we're moving, because now they're talking about whether Anthropic and the Pentagon are starting to work together.
Right. And that's one of the hard things. Earlier we talked about China, and we were talking about Iran, but how there are implications down the road for China and how strong they're going to be. And we know that China is a threat. And so I think there is an AI arms race. Yeah. And so obviously there is an interest in making sure that we're not going to be bested by any sort of weapons that are being used. But there's also, I think, a lot of danger here. And this is even from people at the top of these AI companies, which you can take what they say with a grain of salt. But a lot of them are warning about this. And so as far as I know, OpenAI, which is led by Sam Altman, is now working with the Pentagon. But Anthropic was pushing back because they were going to have to basically sign that their product could be used to act autonomously, autonomous weapons. Now, that's really scary to me, because when it comes to precision or calculations or things like that, as a machine, less likely to make an error. Okay, maybe. But when you're talking about killing people and you don't have a human decision maker behind that weapon or that action, I don't think that's a world we want to live in. And we may not have a choice at this point. So that's something that is concerning. And, I think Christians really need to think hard about. And so most Americans support AI regulation because they see the potential damage, and they see the damage it's already doing to people's minds, to our ability to learn, the damage it's doing in schools and things like that. And yet you have the government, and again, for understandable reasons, wanting no regulation because they want to develop it as fast as possible for weapons usage. But I think there's a lot of ethical questions that we have to ask about that, and I'm not sure they're being asked. At the levels of government anyway, I don't know.
But this conversation we're having right now, just think about this, because one of the things that we say, Liberty, is we are not trying to replace the church, and we all go to church and we'll all be in church on Sunday. But it does seem to me that I don't really think that a pastor is ever going to address the issue of artificial intelligence from the pulpit. I don't know that there are very many Sunday school teachers that are going to be addressing the issue of AI, other than maybe the possible dangers. And yet we need to have a forum where we can have a more robust discussion about this. And it does seem to me that's one of the things that Point of View oftentimes provides.
Yeah, I think these are questions that are affecting people's daily lives. And biblical truth applies to every single aspect of our life. And so even though there may not be a Bible verse about AI, there are so many applicable principles. And so, yeah, I think it's something that we need to discuss, and people realize you can apply biblical wisdom to this. It just takes a little bit of thought.
I do believe the Pope told the Catholic priests, stop using AI to write your sermons.
And I endorse that.
Maybe there's something to follow there.
Yes.
And we did have a conversation around a Friday roundtable about AI sermons, and I did a commentary to summarize that. And most of us said, if you're using that to check some facts, that's one thing. But if you're going to have ChatGPT write a sermon on 1 Peter 2 or on the 10 Commandments, I think we're all saying that's not exactly what we need. Or to write your prayer or whatever it might be. So anyway, these are conversations we have on Point of View. I hope that you'll consider tuning in and supporting this ministry. A couple weeks from now, we're going to have our Truth Team, and I've already been talking about that as well. But let's take a break. When we come back, what happens with socialism? Sometimes you run out of other people's money, and a few mayors are starting to find that out. We'll talk about that right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, one of the articles we've posted here has a very interesting title, Champagne Socialism is Forced to Raise Its Glass to Economic Reality. Now, we've had this conversation before, but it is starting to multiply because, first of all, you have Zohran Mamdani. That's a name probably most of you now know because he's the mayor of New York City. The other day, he actually issued his budget for New York City, which he called austere, and it was $10 billion larger than the entire budget of the state of Florida, whereas the population of New York City is only about 40% of the Sunshine State. So you can figure that out. And he still says we don't have enough money coming in. So he, as this article reminds us, has actually put pressure on the governor of the state of New York, Kathy Hochul, and on the legislators in Albany, New York, to say you've got to pass a wealth budget, a wealth tax, if you will, so that we can meet our budget. And in order to do that, we're also going to have to raid the rainy day fund. We're also going to have to raid the health benefits fund for retired city workers. And that's in New York. Well, then you go to Seattle, and Kathy Wilson has decided that we need more shelters for the homeless. Of course, we need, again, free daycare. I haven't heard her talk about free buses. That's maybe not as big a deal up there. But whether it's free buses, free daycare, whatever, one of the things I've been saying is if you live in New York City and think it's expensive now, imagine how expensive it's going to be when everything is free.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think affordability was the buzzword, right?
Oh, boy.
And I think that's why these people voted for this and did. I mean, it just did not take long at all. It's like, boom, turn around. And here's why we're having to spend extra money and we're going to have to tax you more. So maybe this is a lesson that some millennials needed to learn because it was very much a middle class kind of millennial coalition behind Mamdani, at least. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know how much more affordable it's going to be if you're having to pay for all of that in your taxes. But
it's like the 1984 war is peace, affordability is taxation. I feel like we're living in that world of like just oxymoron.
No, you don't need that money anyway, right? We can all just, It's communal now.
It's our money.
Yeah, shared.
Well, and again, let's go to Seattle for a minute because a lot of people know what's going on in New York City. First of all, how can you come up with a budget that is $10 billion larger than the entire budget of the state of Florida and then call it austere and say, really, you have to pass a wealth tax? If not, I'm going to pass a property tax rate increase, which is going to affect people in all 5 boroughs, and which means middle-class people. But then you got Katie Wilson who says, well, we have a homeless problem, so we need to build 1,000 more shelters. Now, these are almost like those. Have you ever seen those mini houses? I mean, we're talking
Tiny
about
homes.
we're talking about a lot of money. Where does that come from? Well, again, we have wealthy people there in Seattle. I mean, after all, Starbucks and Microsoft and Amazon, and guess what? They are heading out to Texas, Tennessee, Florida, places.
We can tell.
Yeah.
We can tell here in DFW.
Yeah. And so part of it, I think, is the issue that in order to be a socialist, you really have to deny the existence of reality somewhat and think money grows on trees, because there are individuals, especially if they're wealthy, they're mobile and they don't have to actually submit to your tax rate increase, do they?
Well, yeah. And then once they're gone, then you just have a lot of unfunded bills to pay that you've promised people. And I mean, from my perspective, I can hope that you're right, that we're teaching people a lesson in New York City and we don't make this mistake again. But I don't know. I'm as confounded as you, Kerby, by the fact that the sort of basic mechanics of what's going on in socialism is lost on people of our generation. I don't know where we went wrong and where we developed that I don't know, inability to do basic math.
Yeah, I think, again, it all comes back to what's your view of human nature and the story of reality that you tell yourself. Because would they like people who are billionaires or these corporations that are extremely lucrative to be more generous and help out more? Sure, we all would. And there are, again, religious people, Christians are the most generous, right? But I think people want to have a world where they want to force the kind of generosity that they think is appropriate or that they would like to see, instead of taking into account that at some level, businesses, individuals are always going to have at least some or a lot of selfish interest. And so how can you motivate people in a way that is going to be mutually beneficial? So if you were incentivizing companies to stay there and you were creating jobs and you were incentivizing the right things, then more people would benefit from it. But if you're just sitting there saying, well, I wish that they would just, be more generous and now let's force it, well, now they're going to go somewhere else. And so I think it's just fundamentally it's a problem of not really understanding human nature or how the world really works.
Well, again, it is amazing to me, and I haven't figured it out either, but as he also points out in this piece, now you're getting kind of socialism light, but what that's doing is levying regressive taxes that hurt lower income and middle income individuals, because once you get the capital flight that takes place from millionaires or even just upper income individuals, you still have to pay for all the programs, and guess who ends up having to pay for that? And maybe that will be the great wake-up call for the younger generation. But so far, the numbers seem to be going the other direction. And we even the other day had George Barna pointed out that more and more people who go to church on a regular basis also think socialism is better than capitalism.
It's a scary thought. There's that classic line. I don't know if people listening have heard it. I'm sure we probably have on people's social media that are of the persuasion that Jesus was a socialist, which is once again another James Tallarico style interpretation of the Bible. But your point is well made about Christians being the most generous and socialism being a sort of a forced generosity. But what seems to always go hand in hand was with the people that are advocating for these socialism type of policies is also the revocation of things like tax protections for the church. They want to see, 501c3s pay taxes instead of realizing that benefits like that given to the church do enhance its charity, its ability to complete its Christian mission, which a lot of times involves doing what they're advocating for, caring for the poor, caring for the impoverished, offering sort of social programs. And so it's just a thought of everybody get on the same page here. Don't try to take away the protections that allow the charity that you're trying to force people to engage in.
That's a good point. I think, again, people, they have a reality that they want to see. And a lot of it comes from a a good place, because again, a lot of people in our generations, it sounds compassionate. And I also want to say, like, there's corporate greed. There are problems with capitalism too. Like, there's no perfect system. And so we should be able to talk about those things and critique those as well. But then again, say, well, just because there's problems here doesn't mean that we need to go to the opposite extreme and that's going to work well, because if you follow that to its logical conclusion, there's lots of examples in history and even today of how that's worked out for countries. And so again, it sounds nice until you realize it's just not working.
Till you look at Cuba right now, I don't think half the country has any electricity at the current moment.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of how well socialism can get things done.
You both said something that I thought would be helpful to document, because sometimes matter of fact, this was something that people were reacting to, some of the arguments made right now by our Democratic candidate for Senate, James Tallarico, because we've had Arthur Brooks on this program many times, but the first time we ever had him on was on his book, Who Gives? And that was when he was a professor at Syracuse. Later, he was at the American Enterprise Institute. Now he's at Harvard. But the Who Gives book was very helpful because it illustrated that conservatives give much more than liberals. And it isn't just conservatives give more money than liberals, because you might say, well, they might give to their church. They give more time than liberals. They give more time to various soup kitchens. As a matter of fact, conservatives give blood more than liberals do. And he argued that if all of America gave blood the way conservatives did, we would never have a blood shortage in America. So whether it's your money, it's your time, or even your blood, conservatives who get beat over the head by these liberals about the fact that they don't care because they don't want to make the federal government force you to actually support the poor, they are the ones out there doing all of the poor. And there was a very good piece that came out the other day about James Tallarico saying the best estimates are 68% of all the soup kitchens and all the homeless shelters in America are run by Republicans and conservatives, not by liberals and Democrats. Because the Democrats say, we want the government to take care of it. And because you don't want the government to take care of it, you don't have compassion. But the facts really go in the other direction.
Yeah. It's often Christian ministries that need First Liberty's help.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah, they're the ones that always get themselves in trouble.
Yeah.
Because
We've
they're
had homeless
providing
ministries that have been prevented from giving food by the city. It's crazy.
All the stories we've heard about First Liberty, whether it's allowing them to stay in a warm shelter or whether it's handing out food, you've had to deal with so many of those examples. Anyway, just want to let you know that's well documented. You can find that on our website as well. We'll be right back.
It's been more than 10 years since the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling extending same-sex marriage to every state. Gallup polling shows that in the 5 years following the Obergefell v. Hodges decision, public support for gay marriage rose from 60 to 70%. Then it plateaued. Gallup found that among Republicans, approval of same-sex marriage stands at 41%, down from 55% 10 years ago. Perhaps more Americans now understand that when you redefine marriage, you also redefine parenthood. Pre-Obergefell, we were warned of this. Today, our laws and policies increasingly allow two same-sex adults to be the parents of a child. Katie Faust is founder and president of Them Before Us, a global children's rights nonprofit. In an article for The Federalist, she states, "It's now clear that the law cannot simultaneously uphold children's right to their mother and father and affirm same-sex marriage. Family law now is characterized by statutes that regard mothers and fathers as interchangeable parents." Katie Faust points to several examples, including the alteration of birth certificates to legally exclude a child's biological parent. In addition, the term infertility has been reclassified so that same-sex couples can deliberately produce motherless or fatherless children with the help of insurance subsidies. Since Obergefell, the traditional safeguards of the parent-child relationship that stem from biology and even adoption have been eroded and are at risk of erasure. Katie Faust, the wife of a Baptist pastor, has assembled a coalition of high-profile Catholic and evangelical leaders to do something about this. The campaign is called Greater Than, to emphasize emphasized the need to prioritize children's needs over certain adult agendas. It seeks to reassert sex-based realities in family law, adoption screening, birth certificates, divorce, surrogacy, and marriage policy. An Idaho State Legislative Committee has approved a request that the Supreme Court reverse Obergefell. Short of that, society must summon the moral courage to protect children from its worst consequences. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes, and of course we have covered a lot of topics, and you might be saying, I'd like to read a little bit more about that. You talked about this AI grid, you've talked about champagne socialism, we've talked about Trump's way of war. Well, there's one more I thought I'd put on the table. It certainly relates to some of the topics we've addressed here on Point of View, and it's by Thomas Powers. The spell of woke is broke. I would agree. Let's keep it that way. And a lot of it has to be with DEI. Now, we have, of course, talked about DEI with various individuals, but at the same time, we recognize that some of that is changing, and that's due to some of the good material that's come out with the Christopher Rufo and a variety of other individuals there at the Manhattan Institute, and certainly some of the executive orders that have come down from Donald Trump. But if nothing else, Holly, I thought I'd come to you for just a minute, because sometimes the issues that you're addressing, we put them in the category of religious liberty, but really they're DEI. They say that because you want an accommodation, or because you wanted to comment about this issue of DEI or particular issue about homosexuality or transgenderism, we're going to punish you. And so in some respects, even though you're not a DEI organization, you run into that time and time again, don't you?
Sure. Well, everyone loves to talk about DEI until the diversity or inclusion that we want to bring up is Christians. So we've definitely taken a stand that, Christians belong in every environment that anyone else would in the sense of a DEI initiative. But you're so right, Kerby, that so many times the issues that we're litigating with, and our clients arise in the context of mandatory, compelled, HR, DEI training, the whole lot that we see so often. But I mean, kudos to the Supreme Court, kudos to the Trump administration. The winds have really been changing on this front ever since the Students for Fair Admissions case a few years ago, which essentially told us, and that was a racial discrimination, not a religious discrimination case, that the best way to stop racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And that's an old John Roberts quote, but they finally sort of made that the law in Students for Fair Admission. And so they've done a good job in the Supreme Court correcting course on issues like racial discrimination. And so what we're doing at First Liberty is trying to catch those winds and remind people that religious discrimination is, prevalent and happening all the time. And we thankfully have a DOJ right now that is interested in investigating that alongside us. So it's an exciting time to be doing kind of work in the religious liberty space, because we have sort of the wind in our sails.
And I was just thinking, liberty, not only are we talking about religious liberty, but we're talking about meritocracy. And we've had Heather McDonald on this program talking about her book, The Diversity Delusion. And if instead you say, well, I want to have a certain percentage of people that fly airplanes that are of that ethnic background, certain doctors of this ethnic background, and I'm going to change the criteria for individuals to get into medical school or to get into professions, or change the criteria so that I can have a more diverse number of pilots. I don't think we're better off because of that. Do you?
No. And again, it's an example of trying to force an outcome that looks good to modern sensibilities and not really addressing the core of an issue. And so, of course, as Christians, we know that all men are created equal, equally valuable. And so when you are looking at saying, okay, well, there are less women in this field or less people of this race in this field, then some of that you can just say, well, maybe it's preference. Maybe it's not going to be 50-50 in every single field. But if you are seeing that there is a segment of the nation that maybe is underachieving in an area, then instead of trying to force that achievement on without meritocracy, look deeper into the issue and say, well, is there support at the familial level? How are people, do they have access to good education? And how can we strengthen families and things like that, to say we do want everybody to have equality and equal chance to succeed and make something of themselves in the United States. Of course, it's not going to be perfect across the board because everybody's starting place is different, right? But if you are seeing consistent problems with a community and you say, well, we want to address some of those problems, get in at the core so that they can actually succeed. But again, we want to try to force these top-down solutions on things that aren't really helping or serving people.
Well, again, we have some of the material here about the anti-DEI measures and some of the things that have been presented. Also, some great material about just what has happened with the policies and morality. So I want to give that to you to read if you would like to do so. But I thought just before we wind down, Penna Dexter's commentary, which you can hear right now, and she will be with us. I know you'll be on our Truth Team Week, but also Penna Dexter will be reconsidering gay marriage. And what I'm noticing is the younger generation Generation Y and Z, maybe even Generation Alpha, are saying, well, we thought we're for this decision, Obergefell, because we thought it would be fair. Opposite-sex couples should be able to get married. Why shouldn't same-sex couples get married? But we're recognizing, as we've pointed out before, there's a lot of baggage that came with it as well.
Yeah, I think that was the narrative in, 2015 when Obergefell came out, was that this is just about marriage equality. And we saw exactly the Supreme Court justices, to their credit, are not, prophets in any respect of the word, but they did kind of call what was going to come down in the dissents in Obergefell. I can't remember if it was Alito or Roberts. One of them says, this is going to have real implications for families of faith that are going to be adopting. A few years later, what do you get? Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, which is a case about a religious agency that wants to only adopt children to families of heterosexual couples. So some of them sort of saw the writing on the wall maybe before the rest of the country did. I know your listeners were well informed, so I'm not putting that on any of the people listening here. They knew what was going on. But I think there was sort of a misinformation campaign, or maybe a secret hiding of intentions. I don't know, but it has come. The prophecy and the dissents of Obergefell has come true.
Well, and again, that's one of the pieces here. Again, how that's affected family law. We just talked about it a few minutes ago, didn't we? How it affects whether or not a first grader can learn about a family. And instead, you can't talk about a family as being a husband and a wife, a father and a mother, because after all, we got to be fair. So we're going to have to read a little book on same-sex marriage. Heather has two mommies and all sorts of things like that. And then, of course, that has to be changing the textbooks. And then that has to be what we have available in the library. And then we, of course, want to be fair to transgender. All of a sudden, it turned out to be a package deal, didn't it?
It did. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is to read Penna's commentary on pointofview.net and click on the link so that you can look at the organization she's talking about, Greater Than, which emphasizes how the needs of children should be greater than adults' desires. And so, overturning Obergefell is kind of, I think, the big headline, attention-grabbing tagline that they're talking about, justifiably. But there are so many recommendations they make for, at the state level, things that you can advocate for that would put children's interest first again with regard to adoption, education, so many things. And so I think that there's a lot of things we can do starting at a local level to make children's rights preeminent.
Again, her article is available on the website, and you can sign up to receive my articles to your inbox Monday through Friday. Penna's will come up on Saturday. My commentary today is on the Dunning-Kruger administrations, and that's the whole question. Why do dumb people think they're smart? And we found out that we have some major administrations that actually were completely blindsided because they thought they knew more than they really did. So all of that is available. But Holly, we're still waiting on a Supreme Court decision from your particular case, right?
It's the time of year when lawyers that practice at the Supreme Court start playing Supreme Court bingo, as we like to call it, and read tea leaves about what's going on behind those very secretive doors. So yes, still waiting.
Well, pray for that. And of course, you can also see our Pray for America, because of course, that is something that Liberty puts together. So we're simply out of time, not out of topics, but we'll cover those next week. Want to again thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.